Thank you, Pastor Mark. It is a joy to be here today. I have enjoyed every minute of the worship, of the fellowship, just the sweetness of this church. And I know you guys know you have a good thing here, but let me tell you how good it really is. I've been able to get around the state of Arizona and preach in a lot of different churches, and I don't find everywhere I go the kind of worship that's here and just the life of God's Spirit in the midst. So, Pastor Mark, Pastor Rosanna, you guys have just done a fantastic job. Keep up the good work. I can see it, the fruit of your ministry and your faithfulness. So good to see each and every one of my friends that have come to hear me preach another sermon. For those of you from my former churches, thank you for showing up. You'll never know how much that blesses me. Got to greet several in the first service, and that just fills my heart. But your story about introducing the modern city to people from a village reminds me of a story about a guy from the hills of Kentucky. You don't even have to go out of the country to find people that have never seen an elevator or an escalator. This family decided to make the trip into the big city, and so they loaded up their truck and they drove into the town, I guess maybe Louisville or someplace, and they went down into one of those parking garages that you described, and the gentleman, the father, said, you lady folks stay here, and me and my son and the boy are going to go and kind of spy out the land, see what we got to do, next. And so they came to an elevator, and they didn't know what to do with it. The door opened, and a lady came up, and she was rather aged, a little bit bent over, and so she got onto the elevator. Door closed. They stood there for a few minutes. Door opened back up, and out stepped this stunning, attractive 20-year-old lady. Man said, "Boy, go get your ma." So you don't have to go out of the country sometimes to have those kind of third world experiences right here in Kentucky. See, I can say that because I am a Kentuckian, right? Somebody else say that, you'll be offended, but I can get away with it. But so delighted to be here. I want to direct your attention to a rather obscure passage of Scripture. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 23. It is a list of some men that fought alongside King David who distinguished themselves for their exploits in battle. It's kind of a military hall of fame or an honor roll of sorts. They're referred to as David's mighty men. This is coming near the end of David's life, and he's wanting to pay tribute to some of these outstanding soldiers that he went to war with. And you'll see as we read about them that they did some amazing things. Now, this is one of those chapters that if you've ever endeavored to read through the Bible, you might have been tempted to skip because it's a long list of names, like 57 names, and we're not going to read them all, aren't you glad? But we're going to focus on three in particular who are at the top of this list of David's mighty men. And so look with me, beginning of verse 8. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Josheb-Basshebeth, the Tachmonite, chief among the captains. He was called Adino the Eznite, because he had killed 800 men at one time. Now, I looked the word Adino up, what that name means, and it literally means spear. So I assumed that was his weapon of choice. And if you can kill 800 men with one spear, they just call you Spear. I mean, that's your name. And then we have in verse 9, after him was Eleazar, the son of, I don't know if this is Dodo or Dudu, and I don't know which one's worse, but the Ahoite, one of three mighty men with David when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel had retreated. He arose and attacked the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand stuck to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to plunder. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Hararite. The Philistines had gathered together into a troop where there was a piece of ground full of lentils. So the people fled from the Philistines, but he stationed himself in the middle of the field, defended it, and killed the Philistines. So the Lord brought about a great victory. So these three men, Adino, Eleazar, and Shammah, were at the top of the list of David's mighty men. As I mentioned, there are a lot of other names mentioned and some of their exploits, but as you read along, you find that they keep referring us back to these three. There's something about these three that set them apart. Look, as an example of verse 18. Now Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of another three. He lifted his spear against 300 men, killed them, and won a name among these three. Was he not the most honored of three? Therefore he became their captain. However, he did not attain to the first three. Or in verse 20, Benaiah was the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man from Kabzeel, who had done many deeds. He had killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab. He also had gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day. And he killed an Egyptian, a spectacular man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, so he went down to him with a staff, wrested the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. These things Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, did, and won a name among the 3 mighty men. He was more honored than the 30, but he did not attain to the first 3. What was it about these 3 that set them apart? As I questioned about this, one of the things that was puzzling is it doesn't seem that there's a whole lot in common with any of the 3. It said of Adino, he killed 800 men. Okay, that's great, very impressive. It says of Eleazar, he fought until his hand stuck to the sword. It doesn't even say he killed anybody. I assume that he did, but what set him apart was that he just fought until he got really tired and got a hand cramp. It says of Shammah that he planted himself in the midst of a field of lentils and defended it, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Well, that's nothing like the other 2. What is it about these 3 that put them up at the top of the list? And as I considered this, I think that what they had in common was this quality of perseverance or tenacity, stick-to-itness, whatever you want to call it. They wouldn't quit. That's what they seemed to share in common. Let's go back and reflect on them. Adino slew 800 on one occasion. About the only way I can imagine Adino doing this is in maybe one of those narrow ravines that are in such abundance in the Judean hills, where it's just wide enough for 1 or 2 people to pass at a time. And maybe Adino was stationed there to guard that particular passageway. And they told him, Adino, don't let anybody through. So Adino takes his spot there at the narrow ravine, and eventually up in the valley he sees a troop of enemy soldiers coming his way. They approach him and they see that he's outnumbered. They say, out of the way, buddy. And he says, you're not coming through here. And they said, what do you say? And there's 800 of us and 1 of you. Get out of the way. And he says, I said, you're not coming through here. So the general says to the captain, who says to the sergeant, who says to the private, take him out. The private goes up and fights him, and Adino kills him. So they send another guy. He fights Adino. Adino kills him. Kills the third, kills the fourth. By now the bodies are starting to pile up. And they keep sending soldiers, and Adino keeps killing them until at the end of the day, there are 800 enemy combatants dead. Well, that will get you at the top of the king's list. But the thing that kept Adino going was this attitude, I'm not going to quit. Doesn't matter how many they throw at me, I'm just going to keep fighting. And so Adino is the picture of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, 800 to 1. He wouldn't quit. He wouldn't give up no matter how many they sent against him. I remember preaching this sermon in India one time, And when we got to the point where I said Adino is the picture of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, that they didn't understand that I was talking about in gambling terms or statistical terms, odds. And so it came out something like Adino is the picture of perseverance in the face of overwhelming strangeness. He was odd. It took about 5 minutes to untangle that and get going again, but you get it, right? We're talking about statistically speaking, and all things being equal, you know, if you're fighting an enemy soldier of about the same skill level, same weapon, you have about a 50-50 chance of surviving. But then when you fight a second one, you have 1 out of 4 chance of surviving. And if you beat him, then your chances go to 1 out of 8, 1 out of 16, 1 out of 32, 1 out of 64, and that keeps doubling until pretty soon you're talking astronomical odds against you coming out alive. But you see, there's this little secret that God's power plus a person's tenacity equals sure victory. If you don't quit, you will win. That's the point. That's what God's trying to get across, I believe, to us. It reminds me of a woman by the name of Eleanor Workman that I heard about years ago. Eleanor was about 50 years old when she went on a mission trip to Haiti. And she couldn't get out of her mind the images of those starving children, some of them orphaned, some of them abandoned, who were just scrounging for scraps of food to stay alive. And so at the end of that trip, when she went home, she couldn't stop thinking about them, and she felt like God was putting it upon her heart to do something to help them. And so she went to her pastor and she said, "Pastor, I believe God's calling me to go there to start an orphanage, to gather these children, to care for them, to feed them, to educate them." And he said, "Eleanor, you know, that's very noble of you to want to do that, but you're 50 years old. You don't speak the language. You don't have the financial resources to do something like that. You know nothing about running an orphanage." He gave her about 800 reasons why she shouldn't do what God was calling her to do. And so what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you obey God and you do it anyway. And Eleanor Workman, before her life was over, had established not 1 but 2 of the finest orphanages in that very sad country, because she wouldn't quit. She wouldn't give up. I remember when my little brother was on the wrestling team as a sophomore, and the way wrestling works, at least at our high school, was every week you had wrestle-offs with the people in your weight division. And whoever won among the wrestlers on the team in that weight class, you represented the school in the next match. Well, my brother had never made it to a varsity match. He'd always get beat by this one particular guy that was better than everybody else. But one time, when it came to weigh-in, to make sure that you're underweight for your weight classification, he was overweight. That was odd. This had never happened before. He'd always made weight. But on this particular match, they were going up against a school that had a 2-time, soon-to-be 3-time defending state champion wrestler. And that's the day he didn't make weight. I'm a little suspicious of that. I kind of envisioned him the night before eating hamburgers and slurping down milkshakes to make sure he wouldn't make weight. So my brother got to wrestle the 2-time defending state wrestling champ. And so when the match began, it took this guy's name's Ricky Barker from Newport Catholic. It took him about 10 seconds to have my brother on his back, about to be pinned. But if you're on your back in wrestling, there is a technique that you can employ to help prevent you from being pinned. It's called bridging. You put all of your weight on your head, the back of your head, and your heels, and you form a bridge with your body. in order to keep your shoulder blades from being pushed against the mat so you don't get pinned. Now, typically, you do this, you can only do this for 10 or 15 seconds. The idea is to do it long enough to flip over onto your stomach or do some kind of a reversal move, but my brother didn't have any of those kind of moves. And so all he knew to do was just bridge and to keep on bridging. A wrestling match is made up of 3 2-minute periods. That may not sound like a long time, but if you're on your back and you're bridging, 2 minutes sounds like about an eternity, or feels like an eternity. And so we watched as my brother bridged all but 10 seconds of that first 2-minute period. And finally, the horn sounded, ending the period. It was like, phew, well, he got out of that, you know. So then the second period starts, and it took Ricky Barker about 5 seconds to get my brother on his back. And he bridged for 1 minute and 55 seconds until the horn finally sounded. When the third period happened, it was a repeat of the second period. And everybody was amazed. Nobody had ever seen it. They bridged continuously for 3 periods. And at the end of the match, of course, Ricky Barker had racked up a whole bunch of points. And anybody there that day would have seen that the clear winner was Ricky Barker. But I saw 2 winners. I saw one who had the most points, and I saw the other who wouldn't give up, who wouldn't quit. And I think about my brother, and I have to say that that quality has characterized his entire life. And I've found that quitting and not quitting can both be habit forming. You know, if you're inclined to give up easily, well, then it's easier to give up the next time too, and the next time after that. But if you dig in, if you hang on, if you determine that you will not quit, and what we have as believers in Jesus is an inner strength and an inner power that allows us to go beyond what is natural. I don't think Adino is that much better than all the 800 other soldiers. And in fact, I don't think anybody humanly could have the endurance to fight as long as it would take to kill 800 enemy combatants. But when you have God's power plus a person's tenacity, you've got an unbeatable formula. And I believe that's the lesson for us here in the life of Adino. You know, life is filled with examples of people who just wouldn't quit and achieved tremendous things. You know, there's a Hall of Fame jockey by the name of Eddie Arcaro, who, when he retired from racing, had 4,779 first-place finishes and multiple Kentucky Derby wins. But most people don't know that Eddie Arcaro lost the first 250 races that he ever competed in. But he just didn't quit. He kept at it. He stayed with it. And ultimately, he became famous. There's a little poem written by Rudyard Kipling that he composed for his son in an attempt to prepare him for adulthood. It's called If. It says, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on, you'll be a man, my son. It's that ability to keep on going that will put you on the king's list. We also have in this list this guy that it says he fought so long that his hand stuck to the sword. You know, what is it about somebody that gets you on the top of the king's list? I mean, it doesn't even say he killed anybody. He just fought so long and he got so tired that at the end of the day, when brain said to hand, let go, the hand said back to the brain, I forgot how. I don't know if you've ever held anything that long, that hard, until your hand literally cramps around the handle, but it does happen. And that is exactly what happened to Eleazar. he persevered despite overwhelming fatigue. I don't think Vince Lombardi was the first person to coin this phrase, but he had on in the locker room of the Green Bay Packers back in the days when they were winning all their NFL championships, the sign that said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." And the idea is that if you get too tired, it doesn't matter how much talent you have, if you are so tired that you give up, well, the other team is sure to win. And that was Vince Lombardi's way of saying, there's a reason why we work you so hard in conditioning, because fatigue will make a coward out of you. And we're going to work you so hard that at the end of the game, when the other team is fatigued, you still have energy to go. If you've ever wondered, why, Lord, am I going through what I'm going through? Why is this taking so long? God is working in you a quality of perseverance. And he wants you to hold on to the sword until your hand sticks to the sword. That's the quality that will get you on the king's list. And then we have Shammah. He's the guy who positioned himself in the middle of the field, defended it, and killed the Philistines so that the Lord brought about a great victory. Shammah is the picture of perseverance despite a humble assignment. You know, it's one thing to be stationed on the marble steps of the palace and to stand guard there, or to defend the sacred temple from the heathen horde that are coming to desecrate or destroy it. But will you be faithful if you're humble, if your assignment is more humble than that? In Shammah's case, he was asked to defend a field of lentils, which is a type of bean. And when everybody else ran away at the sight of the enemy, Shammah took a stand and said, this is one bean patch those Philistines aren't going to get. And he fought. And through him, the Lord brought about a great victory. You know, I had the pleasure and the privilege for many years of being a pastor, and I grew to appreciate so many people in the body of Christ. And I appreciated the talented people that could play an instrument or sing with the voice of an angel, and so many other people that could do amazing things. But what I really came to appreciate was the people who did the thankless tasks, the behind-the-scenes kind of thing. I think about Mark Lyon, who, when we started the bridge and we took over a little warehouse in Wilder and started having services there, because we didn't own the building and because we really weren't authorized to even be there to have church services for the many years we were there. We had asked permission, and they said, well, it's really not zoned for that. And so we said, okay, and then we did it anyway. But anyway, that's another story. But we couldn't put a sign out front, and it was a very nondescript building amidst other very nondescript buildings that people didn't even know existed. And we thought, how are people ever going to find us? And so Mark said, well, I'll take a sign and I'll put it up on the AA highway, you know, so that people will know there's a church down here. We'll do this every Sunday. And so Mark, we got a vinyl sign made up, and he would go up there every Sunday getting to church before anybody else and strap it onto the guardrail and do that in the cold weather, in the hot summer weather when it's humid and you're sweating every single Sunday. Mark did this for 10 years until, by God's grace, we got delivered from the warehouse and we're able to have a building of our own with a permanent sign. I appreciated Mark for that, but I appreciated him even more after I moved to Arizona, where my daughter and her husband, my son-in-law, were involved in planning a church. And they were meeting at a school. And every Saturday afternoon, my son-in-law would take out those little A-frame signs, you know, put them in different places in the neighborhood. And I thought, well, that's good, but what they really need is a big sign, something that people will really can't miss, you know. And so I had them make up some big vinyl signs that I was able to secure to a brick, kind of a monument type of structure that introduced this community. Yeah, and I thought, you know, that's a good place for a sign. Never mind that we didn't get permission. I'd learned a long time ago, if you ask permission, they might say no. And so just do it until they say you can't do that anymore. And so every Saturday I would get out there and I would be putting up the sign and I would think about Mark. And I would say, God bless Mark. Thank you for Mark, Lord. And I did that for a couple of years. Nothing compared to him. His hand stuck to the sword, despite a humble assignment. You know, I retired from pastoring and moved out to Arizona, and you know, you never stop serving the Lord, right? And so my next assignment was I offered to help my daughter, who was homeschooling her children, 4 children, and so I got to have what we called Pawpaw class, and I could teach any subject I wanted. And she was fine with me teaching them the Bible, and it really, I taught other things too, but it all came back to the Bible. I don't know, just, you know, it works that way for me. And so that was what I threw myself into. Well, I also volunteered in the children's ministry at the church they were involved in planting. And so about 2 or 3 Sundays out of every month, I'm teaching the upper elementary kids, which was a real delight. It was also a learning experience. I was used to teaching people that would sit still, you know, and listen. And then I realized it's like, no, you have to earn their attention and keep their attention. And so I had to get, you know, theatrical and creative and have props and give out a lot of candy, you know. I was almost tempted to bring candy today just because you never know. You know, you might have somebody struggling. So here, this will help. And so, But so I was that was my ministry, you know, teaching the kids during the week, teaching them on Sunday. But every time I would call home or my dad would call me, he would say, you know, Bo, you're not done. You're not done. I said, well, I know I'm not done, Dad. I'm teaching the kids. I'm helping Allie with the school, and I'm teaching on Sunday. And then a blessing came to me I never expected. But some doors began to open up, and I got to be called upon to fill in for pastors who needed a day off or were taking a vacation, or sometimes churches that didn't have a pastor. And I've got to travel all over the state and go to places where I never even knew existed. And some of them are really, really remote, and some of them are kind of like almost dead. There are some towns that had sprung up around the copper mines, which Arizona is well known for. But when it became cheaper to import and buy copper from other countries than it was to mine it and smelt it, or whatever you do with copper, I don't know what they just shut down the mines, even though there were thousands of people living in the houses around those mines who worked in the mines. And so now the jobs are gone, but they can't sell their homes because nobody wants to buy a house where there are no jobs. And so you've got people that are living there somehow eking out an existence, and pretty soon the businesses all begin to fail. And so I would drive into some towns and it's like vacant building, vacant building, vacant building, church. The only church thing that was open. I'd go in, there'd be a handful of people still being faithful to the Lord. I'd say, God bless them, Lord. Their hand is sticking to the sword. And they're faithfully sharing the gospel with the people that are remaining in those towns. But I would mention to my dad, I am still in ministry. I get to go to these places. I get to preach to these people. And he'd say, no, you're not done yet. And then I went through a divorce that I did not want. And I thought, well, any thoughts of me ever being a pastor again are gone for sure. And yet, when I talked to my dad, he would say, you're not done. God's got more for you to do. And of course, he was a great example of that. Do you know that when he came to Faith Church, he and Charlotte were asked to come to help them decide what to do with the church, because the church had been through some trauma and had dwindled down to just a handful of people, maybe 12 or 15 people. And they said, Gene, would you come, please, and just help us figure out what to do? Should we keep going? Should we shut it down? Should we just throw our resources into missions work? Just, would you come, please? And he said, I'll come for 6 months, and we'll help discern this and figure it out. Well, 6 months turned into 7 years. My dad was 76 when he came, and about 83 when he finally convinced Pastor Mark to take over the church. And the Lord, I think, got in on that, of course. But the Lord used my dad. And look at what's happened since then. Look at the ministry that takes place through Isaiah House every month. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people being touched and blessed and helped. Look at the ministry that's taking place in Mexico through this church. And it's all because somebody's hand stuck to the sword. And long after my dad was of an age where most people would be sitting in the recliner reaching for the remote, his hand stuck to the sword. And he preached to me and said, you're not done. Well, I never could have imagined, but I met a wonderful Christian lady who'd lost her husband 6 years earlier to a sudden heart attack, lived 15 minutes from where I was living there in my home in Arizona. And by God's grace, she agreed to marry me. And we'll celebrate our second anniversary on the 12th of this month. And I've continued to preach and walk through whatever doors God would open for me at these little churches that needed a pastor for a Sunday or 2 or 3. But this past Friday, I received word that I had been accepted to become the pastor of a church in Phoenix. And I'll be starting at the end of this month at my own church again. And I, of course, owe that great blessing to the Lord, His faithfulness and His goodness. And I also owe a debt of gratitude to my dad, who set such a great example of a man whose hand stuck to the sword. Do you realize that when he was, after he was diagnosed with cancer and it was told that he would probably have about 6 months to live, do you know he was still here at church every Sunday worshiping the Lord with you? Until he became too weak to do that. But when he was too weak to come to church, then people started coming to him. And he would entertain 4, 5, 6, sometimes 8 people a day just coming to say thank you, to pay their respects, and to say goodbye. And if he knew that there was some question about whether or not they knew the Lord, he would very gently and tactfully urge them to open their hearts to Jesus. He got a call one day from his niece, Ashley, who said, Gene, I'd like to visit with you, but I want my sons to get to know you better too. Could we take you out to lunch? And he said, yes, that'd be great. And so he, in his weakened state, was able to do that. And after they'd eaten, and he, of course, felt compelled to talk to them about the Lord. And he just shared his own personal story of what Jesus has meant to him and how he saved him and gave him a new life. And he could tell that the younger of the two, Ethan, was really dialed in, listening. And at the end, he said, Ethan, have you received Christ yet as your Savior? And he said, no, I haven't. Would you like to do that now? And he said that he would. And so right there at that restaurant table, he led Ethan in a prayer of faith in Christ. Later, my dad got a call from Ashley. He said, Uncle Gene, Ethan wanted me to ask if maybe you would baptize him. And my dad said, well, of course I would. And so after that, whenever I talked to my dad, he said, I've got to get better. I've got to baptize Ethan. I said, well, okay, get better. Let's, all right. So they arranged for a baptism. They found a church, and they made it available to them. And when the time came, my dad went, but he couldn't walk very well at that point, so they wheeled him in. They brought him right up next to the baptistry, and Ethan's father had the honor of actually baptizing his son, but my dad stood up, straightened himself from his wheelchair one last time, and shared the gospel with the 40 or 50 friends and family members that had gathered that day. His hand stuck to the sword right to the end. I want to be like that. And I pray that you do too. We're going to share in communion at this time, and take the cup that you were handed. And I've never seen a cup like this that has the bread and the juice in the same little piece, but I would suggest that you open the bread first. Yeah, even I know that. So take the little piece of bread, which you know represents the body of Jesus. On that night before his arrest, that would be followed by his trial, and then his beating and his execution. He was sharing with his disciples what that would mean. It was for their sins he was dying, and ours. And that involved a perfect sacrifice. The one person who ever lived his life in this world who never sinned. And as that perfect sacrifice, he went to the cross and gave his life, which involved the giving and the breaking of his body. He took the bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat. This is my body. Let us take it in remembrance of him. Now turn your cup over. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Let us take.